Marcus Thompson stood frozen in his driveway, jet-lagged and disoriented, staring at his two-story colonial home in Pine Valley Estates. After 3 months teaching English in Japan, he had returned to find a stranger living in his fully paid house, a home that represented 15 years of dedication as a high school chemistry teacher and his entire life savings. What he was about to discover would expose a web of deception that would shake his quiet suburban community to its core and reveal just how far some homeowners associations would go to expand their power. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The late September sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawn he'd always maintained himself. Marcus had just flown in from Tokyo, his carry-on still in hand, expecting to walk through his familiar front door and collapse into his own bed. Instead, he found himself face to face with an unfamiliar silver Mercedes in his driveway and children's toys scattered across what had been his pristine garden beds. His heart raced as he approached his own front door, the same door he'd painted navy blue just before leaving for his teaching exchange in Japan. Now it was a stark white, and the brass knocker he'd installed himself was gone, replaced by a modern electronic doorbell with a camera. The flowering cherry tree he'd planted when he first moved in, a reminder of his late wife's Japanese heritage, had been cut down, leaving only a fresh patch of sod in its place. Marcus checked the house number again, 1542 Maple Creek Drive. This was definitely his address, but nothing felt right. He'd been meticulous about arrangements before his departure, setting up automatic payments for his utilities and property taxes, installing security cameras he could monitor from abroad, and even hiring a local college student to maintain the yard. Everything had seemed fine during his video calls home, though admittedly the last few weeks in Japan had been so busy with end-of-term activities that he hadn't checked his security feeds, just as he raised his hand to ring the unfamiliar doorbell. The door swung open. A woman in her early 40s appeared, initially smiling but quickly shifting to a concerned expression at the sight of the confused stranger on her doorstep. "Can I help you?" she asked, positioning herself protectively in the doorway. Marcus struggled to keep his voice steady. "This is my house. I live here, or at least I did before leaving for Japan 3 months ago. What's going on?" The woman's expression hardened slightly. "There must be some mistake. My husband and I purchased this house 2 months ago through Pine Valley Estates HOA. We have all the paperwork and deed transfers." "HOA?" Marcus felt his world spinning. "I've never been part of any HOA. This house has been mine for 15 years, fully paid off for the last 5. There must be some mistake." The woman's teenage son appeared behind her, looking concerned. "Mum, should I call Dad?" She nodded, then turned back to Marcus. "Sir, I understand you're confused, but we legally purchased this home. If you'd like, I can have my husband share the documentation with you when he gets home, but I need to ask you to leave our property now." "Our property." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. He stepped back, his carry-on suddenly feeling impossibly heavy. The jet lag, confusion and shock combined into a dizzying mixture that made him grab the railing for support. As if on cue, a Pine Valley Estate security vehicle pulled up to the curb, its yellow light bar flashing silently. A uniformed officer stepped out, hand resting casually on his belt. "Is there a problem here, Mrs. Richardson?" the officer called out, already walking up the driveway. Marcus looked between the security officer and the woman, Mrs. Richardson, who now stood more confidently in what had been his doorway. The world he'd left behind 3 months ago had somehow transformed into an incomprehensible nightmare. His home, the last connection to his late wife, Akiko, the place where they'd planned to grow old together, had apparently been sold without his knowledge or consent, What he didn't know yet was that his situation was about to expose a scandal that would unravel the very fabric of Pine Valley Estate's seemingly perfect community, and his fight to reclaim his home would uncover corruption that reached far beyond his quiet suburban street. Standing on the sidewalk outside what used to be his home, Marcus pulled out his phone with trembling hands and called the one person he knew would help: his sister Elena, a paralegal at one of the city's top law firms. As he waited for her to answer, his mind drifted back to how he'd come to own this piece of Pine Valley Estates long before it had transformed into the manicured, HOA-controlled neighborhood it was today. 15 years ago, this area had been known simply as the Old Mill District, named after the abandoned paper mill that had once been the town's primary employer. The houses were modest but solid, built in the 1960s for mill workers and their families. Marcus and Akiko had fallen in love with the colonial house at 1542 Maple Creek Drive, precisely because it hadn't been part of a cookie-cutter development. Each home in the area had its own character, its own story. They'd purchased the house, using their combined savings and a small inheritance from Akiko's grandmother in Japan. The cherry tree they'd planted in the front yard had been grown from a seed brought over by Akiko's mother, a symbol of bridging their two cultures. Over the years, they'd poured their hearts into every improvement: the custom-built bookshelves in the study, the traditional Japanese garden in the backyard, the sunroom where Akiko would grade papers from her own high school Japanese language classes. The neighborhood had begun changing about 5 years ago, shortly after Akiko's passing. A luxury development company, Vista Properties, had purchased the old mill site and several surrounding parcels. They'd begun construction on Pine Valley Estates, a high-end residential community that slowly encroached on the original neighborhood. One by one, Marcus's longtime neighbors had sold their homes, attracted by Vista's generous offers and promises of upgraded infrastructure. Marcus remembered clearly the day Thomas Wellington, Vista's impeccably dressed development director, had shown up at his door. "Mr. Thompson," he'd said, "your property represents a unique opportunity. We're prepared to offer you 30% above market value." Marcus had declined politely, but firmly. This wasn't just a house to him. It was the repository of his memories with Akiko. What had followed was a series of increasingly aggressive attempts to incorporate his property into Pine Valley Estates. The HOA had formed 3 years ago, and while Marcus's home was technically outside their jurisdiction, they'd begun sending him notices anyway. At first, they were innocuous: invitations to community meetings, offers to join voluntarily, glossy brochures showing swimming pools and tennis courts. Marcus had ignored them all. His focus had been on healing after Akiko's loss, throwing himself into his teaching and maintaining their home, exactly as they had loved it. When the opportunity for the teaching exchange in Japan had arrived, it had seemed like fate, a chance to connect with Akiko's heritage and perhaps find some closure. Before leaving, he'd taken every precaution. His property taxes were paid through an escrow account, utilities were on autopay, and he'd hired Jason, one of his former students, to maintain the yard. He'd even set up security cameras that connected to an app on his phone, though he realized now he hadn't checked them in weeks due to his hectic schedule at the Japanese school. "Marcus," Elena's voice snapped him back to the present. "What's wrong? Aren't you supposed to be just getting back from Japan?" "Elena, something's happened," he began, his voice cracking. "Someone's living in my house. They're saying they bought it through the HOA, but that's impossible. I've never been part of the HOA." There was a pause on the line. "Don't move," Elena said, her voice shifting into professional mode. "I'm calling Robert Martinez from our real estate litigation team. Meet us at the Starbucks on Cedar Street in 30 minutes. And Marcus, don't confront anyone else until we talk." As Marcus walked toward his rental car, still parked at the curb, he noticed other changes in the neighborhood. The eclectic mix of homes, he remembered, had been transformed. Houses had been painted in HOA-approved colors, gardens standardized, and individual character stripped away. Even Mrs. Chen's vibrant dragon sculptures, which had delighted neighborhood children for decades, were gone from her front yard, replaced by perfectly trimmed boxwood shrubs. He slid into his car, his head spinning with questions. How could a house be sold without its owner's knowledge or consent? What had happened to all his belongings? And most importantly, what had become of the small copper urn containing Akiko's ashes, which had rested on the mantel in their bedroom? The security officer was still watching him from the rearview mirror as he pulled away from the curb. Marcus gripped the steering wheel tightly, a mix of grief, rage, and determination building inside him. This wasn't just about a house anymore. It was about preserving the last physical connection he had to his life with Akiko, and he would fight with everything he had to get it back. The Starbucks on Cedar Street was busy with the afternoon rush when Marcus arrived. He spotted Elena and a distinguished-looking man in his 50s, whom he assumed was Robert Martinez, at a corner table. His sister immediately stood and embraced him, while Robert Martinez observed with careful attention a leather portfolio open in front of him. "Tell us everything," Elena said as they sat down. "Start from the moment you arrived home." Marcus recounted the confrontation with Mrs. Richardson and the security guard, his voice shaking slightly as he described the changes to his property. Robert listened intently, occasionally making notes in a small leather-bound notebook. "And you've never been a member of the Pine Valley Estates HOA?" Robert asked, his pen poised. "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us." "Now back to the story." "Never," Marcus replied firmly. "I refused all their attempts to get me to join. I've got copies of the letters I sent them, specifically stating I wasn't interested." Robert nodded, then pulled out a tablet. "I did some quick research before coming here. According to county records, your property was sold at auction 2 months ago for delinquent HOA dues totaling $32,000. "That's impossible," Marcus exclaimed, causing several nearby customers to turn and stare. "I've never owed them a penny, because I was never a member." Robert held up a hand. "I believe you. But look at this." He turned the tablet around, showing a document that made Marcus's blood run cold. It was a membership agreement for the Pine Valley Estates HOA, apparently bearing his signature and dated 6 months ago. "That's not my signature," Marcus said immediately. "I was already in Japan when this was supposedly signed." Eleanor leaned in, studying the document. "It's a good forgery, but there are inconsistencies." "Marcus, do you have any documents with your actual signature that we can compare?" Marcus pulled out his passport, and they laid it next to the tablet. The differences were subtle but clear. The HOA signature had a slight tremor in the loops that Marcus's actual signature lacked. "This is fraud," Robert said quietly, his expression grave. "But it's sophisticated fraud. They created a paper trail. According to these records, after you joined the HOA, they began assessing fees, including back fees they claimed you owed for years of non-compliance. When those weren't paid, they moved to foreclose." "But I never received any notices," Marcus protested. "Nothing was forwarded to me in Japan." "That's another red flag," Elena interjected. "They would have been required by law to make reasonable attempts to contact you. Did you file a change of address with the post office before leaving?" "Yes, and I had Jason checking my mail weekly anyway." Marcus paused, suddenly remembering something. "Jason, I haven't been able to reach him for weeks. The last time we spoke, he mentioned something about the HOA threatening to fine him for unauthorized maintenance work on a property." Robert's eyebrows rose. "This Jason, He was maintaining your property while you were away. Yes, he's a former student. I have a signed contract with him. He was supposed to mow the lawn, water the plants, and check on the house weekly. He was even supposed to be monitoring my security cameras. Marcus's voice trailed off as he pulled out his phone and opened his security app. His hands began to shake as he stared at the screen. The cameras, they're offline. They have been for exactly 2 months. Robert and Elena exchanged glances. The same time as the supposed auction, Elena said softly. Mr. Thompson, Robert said, leaning forward, I believe you've been the victim of a calculated scheme. They waited until you were out of the country, fabricated HOA membership, created false debt, and then moved to foreclose when they knew you wouldn't be able to defend yourself. But why? Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Why target me specifically? Your property is the last remaining non-HOA house in what's now prime real estate, Robert explained. Based on similar cases I've seen, they probably already have plans for your lot. The Richardsons may be innocent purchasers, but the sale itself appears to be the result of fraud. What do we do now? Marcus asked, looking between his sister and the attorney. First, we file for an emergency injunction to prevent any further changes to the property, Robert said, already pulling out his phone. Then we demand all records related to the foreclosure and sale. Elena, can you start drafting the paperwork? Elena nodded, but Marcus barely heard their subsequent legal discussion. His mind was on the copper urn that had sat on his bedroom mantel. My wife's ashes, he interrupted. I need to know what happened to our belongings. Robert's expression softened. We'll add an emergency discovery request about the disposition of your personal property. If they followed normal procedures, everything should have been placed in storage. And if they didn't follow normal procedures, Marcus asked, dreading the answer. The attorney's silence spoke volumes. Finally, Elena reached over and squeezed her brother's hand. We'll find everything, Marcus, and we'll make them pay for what they've done. As they left the coffee shop, Marcus noticed a black SUV with tinted windows parked across the street, its engine running. The driver's window lowered slightly, and he caught a glimpse of Thomas Wellington, the Vista Properties Development Director, watching them intently before the vehicle pulled away from the curb and disappeared into traffic. The sight sent a chill down Marcus's spine. This wasn't just about a house or even about fraud. He was up against something much bigger and more sinister than he'd imagined. Marcus spent that night in Elena's guest room, tossing and turning as the full weight of his situation crashed over him in waves. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the strange white door that had replaced his navy blue one, the missing cherry tree, the unfamiliar toys scattered across what had been Akiko's carefully planned garden beds. Sleep proved impossible as questions tormented him. Where were their photos, the handmade quilts Akiko's mother had sent them, the collection of chemistry books he'd accumulated over 15 years of teaching? At 3 a.m., he found himself sitting in Elena's kitchen, scrolling through photos on his phone, snapshots of his house from before he left for Japan. Each image was like a knife to his heart. Akiko's cherry tree in full bloom last spring, the two of them standing proudly in front of their newly painted door, the traditional garden they'd spent weekends perfecting. He lingered on a photo of their bedroom mantel, the copper urn containing Akiko's ashes, visible in the center, flanked by framed photos of their life together. His hands began to shake so violently that he nearly dropped the phone. The magnitude of what had been stolen from him wasn't just about property. It was about memory, identity, and the physical connections to a life shared with someone he'd lost too soon. Elena found him there an hour later, still staring at his phone. Without a word, she put on a pot of coffee and sat down across from him. I can't stop thinking about what else they've taken, Marcus said quietly. It's not just the house, it's everything inside it, everything that made it ours. We'll get "It all back," Elena assured him. But Marcus noticed the worry lines around her eyes. "What if we don't?" His voice cracked. "What if they've thrown it all away? The urn, our photos, her mother's quilts. These aren't just things, Elena. They're all I have left of her." Elena reached across the table and gripped his hand. "Then we make them pay, not just legally but in every way possible. We expose whatever they're doing, because I guarantee we're not the only ones they've done this to." Marcus nodded slowly, his initial shock and grief beginning to crystallize into something harder and more focused. "Jason," he said suddenly. "We need to find Jason. He was there, he saw something, and then he disappeared." Elena was already pulling out her laptop. "Let's start with social media. What's his full name?" "Jason Chen. He's Mrs. Chen's grandson. You remember her, the one with the dragon sculptures they made her remove?" Marcus watched as Elena typed. "He's studying computer science at State University." After several minutes of searching, Elena sat back with a frown. His social media accounts are all gone. Everything, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, all deleted about 2 months ago. "The same time as the auction," Marcus noted, his teacher's mind beginning to analyze patterns. "The same time my security cameras went offline. The same time they claim I joined the HOA. None of this is coincidence." A text message lit up Marcus's phone. "Robert Martinez. Emergency meeting at my office, 8 a.m. Found something significant." Eleanor read the message over his shoulder. "Robert doesn't use words like significant lightly," she said. "Try to get some rest. We've got a long day ahead." But rest wouldn't come. Instead, Marcus spent the pre-dawn hours making lists in his mind. Every change he'd noticed to his property, every interaction he'd had with the HOA before leaving, every detail about Jason's sudden disappearance. He was a chemistry teacher. He understood that reactions required careful observation and analysis. The HOA's scheme was a complex reaction, and he was determined to understand every component. As the sun began to rise, Marcus stood at Elena's kitchen window, watching the neighborhood come to life. School buses began their rounds, early morning. Joggers passed by, and sprinklers clicked on in perfectly manicured lawns. Everything looked normal, peaceful, but now he knew better. Beneath the surface of this suburban tranquility, something corrupt was growing, spreading like a cancer from neighborhood to neighborhood. He thought about Mrs. Richardson and her family, now living in his house. Were they truly innocent purchasers, or part of the scheme? He remembered the fear in her eyes when she'd first opened the door, the way she'd positioned herself protectively in the doorway. No, his instincts told him they were victims too, even if they didn't know it yet. His phone buzzed again. Another text from Robert. "Bring any documentation you have of repairs or improvements made to your house in the past 5 years. Property. Assessments too, if you have them." Marcus felt a glimmer of hope. Robert clearly had found something, some angle they could use. He would get his house back, find Akiko's urn, and expose whatever corrupt scheme the HOA was running. But first, he needed coffee, and lots of it. It was going to be a very long day. Robert Martinez's office occupied the entire top floor of a downtown law building, offering a commanding view of the city skyline. When Marcus and Elena arrived at precisely 8 a.m., they found not just Robert waiting for them, but an entire team of legal professionals gathered around a conference table covered in documents and laptops. "Mr. Thompson," Robert gestured to an empty chair, "I appreciate you coming in so early. This is Sarah Patel, our forensic accountant, and James Wong, our real estate fraud specialist." He nodded to 2 sharp-looking professionals at the table. "What they've uncovered in the past few hours is troubling." Sarah Patel, a woman in her 40s with keen eyes and an iPad full of spreadsheets, spoke first. "We've been analyzing Pine Valley Estate's financial records, the publicly available ones at least. There's a pattern of suspicious property, acquisitions dating back 3 years. Your house isn't the first they've taken through questionable means. She pulled up a map on the large screen at the end of the room. Red dots appeared across the neighborhood layout. Each red dot represents a property that was foreclosed on by the HOA under similar circumstances. Homeowners who insisted they weren't members, sudden large fee assessments, quick sales at auction. The pattern forms a perfect circle around what appears to be the old paper mill site, Marcus finished, leaning forward, where Vista Properties is planning their new development. James Wong nodded, adjusting his glasses. Exactly. We found building permits filed by Vista Properties for a massive luxury complex. High-end condos, retail space, even a private school. But they needed a certain radius of control around the site for zoning approval. And my house fell within that radius, Marcus said quietly. Your property was actually crucial to their plans, James continued. According to the zoning requirements, they needed control of every property within a 300-foot radius of the proposed development site to proceed. Your house was the last holdout. Elena, who had been taking notes, looked up sharply. So the HOA is working with Vista Properties. More than working with them, Sarah interjected. They're owned by them. Vista Properties created the HOA 3 years ago as a shell company. The entire board of directors consists of Vista employees or their family members. Marcus felt his head spinning. But that's illegal, isn't it? They can't just create an HOA to seize properties. It's very illegal, Robert confirmed, but they covered their tracks well. We only found the connection because Sarah noticed that the HOA's incorporation papers were notarized by the same person who notarized Vista's building. Permits, Thomas Wellington's wife. Marcus remembered the black SUV from the previous day. Wellington's been watching us. He was outside Starbucks yesterday. Robert's expression darkened. They're nervous. They know we're digging. This morning, I received a call from their legal team offering to resolve the situation amicably. They proposed paying you double your property's market value to walk away. No, Marcus said firmly, this isn't about money. This is about justice, not just for me, but for everyone they've done this to. I was hoping you'd say that, Robert smiled, because we're not just going to get your house back. We're going to expose their entire operation. He turned to James. Show him what you found in the county records. James pulled out a thick folder. Every HOA foreclosure requires specific documentation filed with the county. In reviewing your case, I noticed something odd. The notary's stamps on your foreclosure documents. They're dated during a period when the notary, Mrs. Wellington, was actually out of the country. We have her travel records. Sarah picked up the thread. And it gets better. The bank account where they claimed your HOA dues were supposed to be paid. It wasn't even opened until after they started assessing late fees. The entire paper trail is fabricated. Elena leaned forward eagerly. This is enough for an immediate injunction, isn't it? Robert nodded. We filed for one this morning. But there's something else you need to see, Marcus. He slid a document across the table. This was buried in Vista's permit applications. Look at the proposed name for their new school. Marcus picked up the paper, and his blood ran cold. There in crisp black text was the name, the Akiko Thompson Academy of International Studies. They've been planning this for years, Robert said softly. They researched you, knew about your wife's passing, even incorporated her name into their plans. They probably thought it would prevent you from fighting back if you discovered it. Marcus stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. They thought using my dead wife's name would make me cooperate. His voice shook with rage. They steal our home, everything we built together, and then try to use her name for their profit. Elena grabbed his arm. Marcus, this is good news. It proves premeditation. They can't claim this was just a bureaucratic error anymore. Robert nodded. We've got them. Now we just need to find Jason Chen. As your property manager, he would have witnessed their initial attempts to take control of your property. His testimony could be crucial. "And my things?" Marcus asked. "Akiko's ashes?" "We've got a team working on tracking down the storage facility they used," Sarah assured him. "Standard procedure requires them to inventory and store all personal property for at least 6 months after a foreclosure." Marcus sat back down, his mind racing. They had proof of fraud, proof of corruption, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were still missing something bigger. Why go to such elaborate lengths? Why risk so much to acquire these specific properties? "Robert," he said slowly, "I need to see those building permits for their new development. All of them. Something tells me we're not seeing the whole picture yet." As Robert's team pored over Vista Properties' building permits, Marcus found himself drawn to Sarah Patel's digital map of the affected properties. Each red dot represented another family displaced, another home stolen through fraudulent means. He began scanning addresses, remembering neighbors who had suddenly decided to sell over the past few years. "Wait," he said suddenly, pointing to one of the addresses. 1687 Maple Creek Drive. That was the Chen family's house, Jason's grandmother. Mrs. Chen would never have voluntarily given up that house. She'd lived there for 40 years. Sarah quickly pulled up the records for that address, foreclosed 8 months ago, also for unpaid HOA dues. Same pattern, they claimed she agreed to join the HOA, assessed massive fines for her garden decorations, then moved to foreclose when she allegedly didn't pay. "Those dragon sculptures were her life's work," Marcus said quietly. "She was a renowned artist. Museums had offered to buy them, but she always refused. She wanted them to stay in the community." He paused, remembering something. Jason was living with her while attending university. He would have been there when all this happened. Elena had been making calls on her cell phone. She hung up and turned to the group. "I just spoke with a contact at State University." Jason Chen withdrew. From all his classes 2 months ago, no forwarding address, no explanation, just disappeared. "The same time they moved on your house," Robert noted. "This can't be coincidence." James Wong had been studying the building permits intently. "There's something odd about these environmental impact studies," he said, spreading several documents across the table. "They've done multiple surveys of the old paper mill site, but the results are inconsistent. The first study, from 2 years ago, showed significant ground contamination, toxic chemicals, heavy metals, the kind of thing you'd expect from an old industrial site. But the most recent study, dated just 3 months ago, shows the site completely clean." "That's impossible," Marcus said. "I'm a chemistry teacher. Those kinds of contaminants don't just disappear. They'd need extensive remediation, which would cost millions and take years." Sarah was already typing furiously on her laptop. "The company that performed the second survey, Green Tech Environmental Solutions, was incorporated just 4 months ago. Their only client is Vista Properties." She looked up grimly. "And their chief technical officer is Thomas Wellington's brother-in-law." "They're falsifying environmental reports," Elena said. "But why go to all this trouble? Why not just do the proper remediation?" Marcus stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city skyline. His teacher's mind was connecting dots, forming hypotheses. "Because they're not planning to clean it up at all," he said slowly. "They're planning to build right over it. That's why they need control of all the properties in a specific radius. They're creating a buffer zone." Robert's eyes widened. "If contamination from the site spreads to surrounding properties, they'd be legally liable," Eleanor finished. "Unless they owned all the potentially affected properties through their shell company, HOA. "We need to find Jason," Marcus said firmly. "He was studying computer science. If he witnessed their fraud with his grandmother's house, if he saw them falsifying documents, he might have evidence." Sarah nodded. "But if they know that—" A heavy silence fell over the room. Marcus remembered the black SUV following them, Wellington's watchful presence. If Jason had uncovered evidence of Vista's plans, what lengths would they go to silence him? Sarah's computer chimed. "I found something," she said. Before his social media went dark, Jason made one last post on a private GitHub repository. It's just a string of numbers and letters. "Can you pull it up?" Marcus asked, moving to look. Over her shoulder, the sequence appeared on her screen. 40 N 72G1345.8. Those are coordinates," Marcus said immediately. "And I know exactly where they lead." He pulled out his phone, entering the numbers into a mapping application. "It's the old boathouse at Lake Morrison. I used to take my advanced chemistry students there for water testing experiments. Jason was in that class 3 years ago." Robert was already reaching for his coat. "We need to check it out. If Jason left evidence there—" "I'm coming with you," Marcus said. "I know that boathouse. There are dozens of hidden spots where a student might stash something." Elena stood as well. "I'll stay here with Sarah and James. Keep digging through the records. We need to find out exactly how deep this contamination cover-up goes." As they headed for the elevator, Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Stay away from the boathouse. Not safe." Marcus showed the message to Robert, whose expression hardened. "He's alive," the lawyer said. "And he's scared. We need to move fast before Vista realizes we're onto them." "What about the emergency injunction?" Marcus asked as they reached Robert's car. "The judge will rule this afternoon," Robert replied, starting the engine. "But finding Jason and whatever evidence he has might be more important now. This isn't just about getting your house back anymore. If we're right about the contamination cover-up, people's lives could be at risk." Marcus nodded grimly. Somewhere in that boathouse, Jason had hidden information that could expose Vista's entire scheme. But would they find it before Wellington and his people did? And more importantly, would they find Jason alive to testify about what he knew? The drive to Lake Morrison took 20 minutes, but to Marcus, it felt like hours. Every passing car became a potential threat. Every black SUV, a possible tail. Robert drove carefully, taking an indirect route and checking the rearview mirror frequently. The late morning sun sparkled on the lake's surface as they approached, making the scene appear deceptively peaceful. The old boathouse stood at the far end of the lake, its weathered wood and peeling paint a stark contrast to the luxury homes that had sprung up along the shoreline in recent years. Marcus noticed something else as they parked. Many of those homes bore Pine Valley Estates signs. Vista Properties' reach extended even here. "The lake," Marcus said suddenly. "The chemistry. Teacher in him making connections. The paper mill used to dump waste into the northern end of the lake, near their property. If that contamination is still present, it could leach into the groundwater, affecting all these properties." Robert finished, understanding dawning on his face. The development isn't just about luxury homes and a school. They're buying up properties to prevent future lawsuits when people start getting sick. They approached the boathouse cautiously. The padlock on the door was new, definitely not the rusty one Marcus remembered from his teaching days. Robert produced a small camera and began documenting everything, from the lock to the fresh tire. "Tracks in the gravel. Someone's been here recently," he observed, pointing to cigarette butts near the door. "Multiple people based on the different brands." Marcus examined the building's exterior. There used to be a loose board on the back wall. My students would sometimes hide notes and small items behind it, a kind of unofficial time capsule tradition. They made their way around the building. The board was still there, but as they got closer, Marcus noticed something odd. "These screws," he said, pointing to where the board met the frame. "They're new. Someone's removed and replaced this board recently." Robert photographed the screws before Marcus carefully removed them. Behind the board was a small cavity, and wedged inside was a waterproof phone case containing a USB drive and a handwritten note. The note was in Jason's precise handwriting. "Mr. T, if you're reading this, I'm sorry I disappeared. They threatened my grandmother after she refused to sell. Said they'd deport her back to China if she fought the foreclosure. She's been here legally for 45 years, but they forged documents suggesting immigration fraud. I started digging into their operations. What I found, it's bigger than the HOA. Check the drive. Be careful who you trust. Some of the local police are on Vista's payroll." "Jason." "Smart kid," Robert said, carefully bagging the evidence. "He knew you'd figure out the coordinates eventually." Just then, they heard cars approaching on the gravel road. Robert quickly replaced the board while Marcus pocketed the note and drive. They moved around to the front of the boathouse just as two black SUVs pulled up, blocking their car. Thomas Wellington stepped out of the first vehicle, followed by two men who were very obviously not real estate developers. From the second SUV emerged Police Chief Michael Harrison, his expression grim. "Mr. Thompson," Wellington called out, his voice carrying false concern. "Out for a nostalgic visit to your old teaching spot? Not really the best time for sightseeing, considering your situation. Just showing my lawyer the local attractions," Marcus replied evenly, grateful they'd already secured Jason's evidence. Chief Harrison stepped forward. "Mr. Thompson, we've had reports of suspicious activity around here. I'm afraid I'll need to ask what you're doing on private property." "This is public land," Marcus said. "Lake Morrison Park is city property." Wellington smiled. "Actually, Vista. Properties acquired this parcel from the city 3 months ago." "You're trespassing." Robert pulled out his phone. "Interesting. I don't recall seeing any public notice of that sale." "That would be a violation of City Ordinance 47.3, requiring public hearings before the sale of public recreational land." The chief's hand moved to rest on his weapon. "Regardless, I'm going to have to ask you both to leave, now." As they walked to their car, Wellington called out, "Oh, and Marcus, if you found anything interesting during your visit, I should remind you that removing items from private property could be considered theft. We wouldn't want to add criminal charges to your legal challenges." The threat was clear, but Marcus kept his expression neutral as they drove away. Once they were safely out of sight, Robert pulled over. "They've been watching the boathouse," he said. "They knew Jason left something there, but they couldn't find it. That's why they bought the property, to keep people away while they searched." Marcus pulled out the USB drive. "We need to get this to Elena and the team, but first—" He took out his phone and began typing. "What are you doing?" Robert asked. "Sending an email to every local news outlet and environmental group in the state," Marcus replied, "telling them about Vista Properties' sudden private acquisition of public parkland and suggesting they look into how that sale happened. If Wellington wants to play hardball, let's see how he handles public scrutiny." Robert smiled grimly. "Good thinking. The more eyes on them, the harder it will be for them to operate in the shadows." But Marcus, his expression grew serious. "They're not going to back down easily. That show of force back there, that was a message. They're willing to go to extreme lengths to protect their scheme." "So am I," Marcus said firmly. "They didn't just steal my house. They're stealing people's lives, their health, their future, and they're using my wife's name to do it. This ends now." Back at Robert's office, the team huddled around Sarah's computer as she carefully examined the contents of Jason's USB drive. The young man had been thorough. The drive contained hundreds of documents, emails, and database files he'd somehow extracted from Vista Properties systems. "This kid's got serious skills," Sarah muttered, scrolling through lines of code. "He created a backdoor into their network while doing IT work for his grandmother's HOA appeal. He's been collecting evidence for months." Elena leaned forward, pointing at the screen. "Look at these email exchanges between Wellington and the environmental testing companies. They didn't just falsify the recent reports. They've been covering up contamination data for years." "Wait," Marcus interrupted. Go back to that spreadsheet. Something had caught his eye, a familiar name in a column of property acquisitions. Margaret Sullivan, 1456 Oak Street. That's impossible. She passed away 5 years ago. I went to her funeral. Sarah pulled up the transaction details. According to this, she sold her property to Vista Properties 8 months ago. There's even a signature. Another forgery, Robert said grimly. They're not just targeting living residents. They're falsifying sales from deceased homeowners before their families can claim the properties. James Wong, who had been quiet for some time, spoke up. These construction plans, they're not just building on contaminated land. They're planning to cap it with concrete and build underground parking structures. That would trap the contamination and force it to spread laterally through the groundwater into all the surrounding properties they now control through the HOA. Marcus finished. They're creating a disaster in slow motion. Robert's phone buzzed. A text from his contact at the courthouse. His expression darkened as he read it. The judge denied our emergency injunction. Apparently, he owns 3 investment properties managed by Vista. They've got judges in their pocket too, Elena exclaimed. How deep does this go? Deep enough. That we need to change tactics, Robert replied. We can't rely on local courts. We need to go federal. Environmental crimes, mail fraud, RICO violations. But first, he turned to Marcus, we need to get your story out there. Make it too public for them to bury. I may have something for that, Sarah said, opening another file. Jason downloaded their entire email server backup, including messages about other properties they're targeting. Look at this development map. The screen showed a complex network of planned acquisitions spreading across 3 counties. Pine Valley Estates was just the beginning. Vista Properties had similar schemes running in multiple communities, each using fraudulent HOAs to seize properties around contaminated industrial sites. It's a pattern, Marcus said, his teacher's mind analyzing the data. They find contaminated properties, buy them cheap, then use HOAs to control the surrounding area. They're building an empire on poison. Elena was already drafting press releases. We need to get this to every major news outlet, environmental groups too. The more people who have copies of this evidence, the harder it will be for them to suppress it. We also need to find Jason, Marcus insisted. That text about his grandmother, they're using immigration threats to silence people. How many other families have they threatened? Sarah raised her hand from her computer. I might have a lead on that. Jason's last credit card transaction was at a motel in Canada, just across the border. He's smart. He got his grandmother out of their reach. Robert nodded approvingly. Good. We can have our Canadian colleagues check on them discreetly. But we need to move fast on everything else. Once we start releasing this information, they'll come at us with everything they have. Marcus finished. He thought about the confrontation at the boathouse, the implied threats. We need to protect ourselves too. If they've got local police on their payroll, already handled, Robert assured him. I've got private security watching Elena's house and this office, and I've arranged for a safe house if we need it. He paused, looking at Marcus seriously. There's something else we need to discuss. The Richardsons, the family living in your house, I had them investigated. They're not part of the scheme. They're victims too, but in a different way. What do you mean? Vista Properties approached them 6 months ago, offered them the house. At 20% below market value, they knew the Richardsons were desperate. Medical bills from their youngest daughter's cancer treatment had nearly bankrupted them. They used that desperation, just like they used your absence and Mrs. Chen's vulnerability. Marcus sat back, processing this information. He thought about Mrs. Richardson's protective stance in the doorway, her fear when she'd first seen him. We need to help them too, he said finally. When this all comes out, they'll lose their home, just like I did. Actually, Elena interjected, they might be valuable allies. If they're willing to testify about how Vista Properties approached them, it would show a pattern of targeting vulnerable people, Robert nodded. But first, we need to ensure everyone's safety. Vista's not going to sit quietly once we start exposing them. Just then, every phone in the room buzzed simultaneously. An emergency news alert. Breaking, suspicious fire at Lake Morrison boathouse. Police suspect arson. They're destroying evidence, Sarah said. No, Marcus replied, his voice hard. They're sending another message. But they're too late. We've got everything we need right here. Time to send a message of our own. The response from Vista Properties came swiftly and aggressively. By evening, their legal team had filed a lawsuit against Marcus for defamation, claiming $50 million in damages. They simultaneously launched an aggressive PR campaign, with Thomas Wellington appearing on local news stations portraying Vista as a victim of baseless accusations by a disgruntled homeowner. These allegations are completely unfounded, Wellington said smoothly on Channel 7's Evening News. Mr. Thompson abandoned his property for months, failed to maintain it according to community standards, and now wants to blame others for his negligence. The environmental claims are particularly ridiculous. We have multiple independent studies confirming the safety of all our development sites. Marcus watched the interview from Elena's living room, his hands clenched into fists. Robert had advised them all to stay away from their offices after dark. Private security had reported multiple suspicious vehicles conducting surveillance. Look at his left eye, Elena observed, watching Wellington. It twitches every time. He mentions the environmental studies. He knows we have proof they're fabricated. Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. My grandmother is safe. USB was insurance policy. More evidence in dragon sculptures before they destroyed them. Check museum storage. J. The dragons, Marcus breathed. Mrs. Chen didn't just create them for art. She was documenting the contamination. She must have suspected something years ago. Before they could discuss further, Eleanor's security system chimed. The cameras showed two men in suits at her front door, accompanied by Chief Harrison. Mr. Thompson, the chief called out, his voice carrying through the door. We have a warrant to search these premises for stolen corporate documents. Robert, who had been conferring with his team via video call, immediately spoke up. Don't open the door. That warrant would have had to come from Judge Sullivan, the same one who denied our injunction. I'm calling a federal judge right now, but they had underestimated Vista's reach. Within minutes, 3 more police cars arrived, and they could hear someone working on the back door. Time to go, Elena said calmly, grabbing her laptop. Safe house protocol, just like we planned. They moved quickly to the garage, where Elena's Tesla waited. She'd had it swept for tracking devices earlier that day. As the garage door opened, they could hear the front door being breached. Stop right there, Chief Harrison's voice boomed. But Eleanor had already activated the Tesla's ludicrous mode. They shot out of the garage and down the street, leaving the police scrambling to their vehicles. Marcus looked back to see the chief speaking urgently into his radio. They'll set up roadblocks, Elena said, taking a sharp turn down a side street. Good thing we planned for that too. She pressed a button on her dash, and the Tesla's color began to change, a high-tech wrap that shifted from red to dark blue. She pulled into a shopping center parking lot, quickly swapping the license plates for a different set. Sarah's idea, she explained, seeing Marcus's surprised expression. She said, if they're playing dirty, we need to be prepared. Robert's voice came through the car's speakers. He was still on video call. Head to Safe House B. A's probably. Compromised if they got a warrant that fast. I'm sending our evidence to the FBI's Public Corruption Unit now. And Marcus, check your email. Marcus pulled out his phone to find an email from an environmental reporter at the Washington Post. Is this about the Lake Morrison contamination story? I'm very interested in speaking with you. National media attention, Robert said. Once this hits the major papers, it'll be harder for them to operate in the shadows. Elena took another turn, heading toward the outskirts of town. We need to get to those dragon sculptures before Vista realizes what they contain. If Mrs. Chen documented the contamination, she'd have put the evidence inside them, Marcus finished. That's why they were so insistent on removing them, not because they violated HOA rules, but because they were physical proof of the contamination. His phone buzzed again. Another message from Jason. Museum curator is friend. Sculptures. In basement storage. Password is grandmother's birthday. Hurry! But just then, they spotted multiple black SUVs converging on their location from side streets. Wellington's security team had anticipated their route. Hold on, Eleanor said grimly, making a sudden turn onto a construction site. The Tesla's electric motor gave them a silent advantage as they wound through the partially built structures. The museum closes in an hour, Marcus said, checking his phone. If we don't get there today, Vista will have someone there first. Elena finished, skillfully maneuvering through the site. We need a diversion. Already on it, Robert's voice came through. I've just leaked a tip to local news that Vista executives are holding an emergency meeting at their downtown office. That should draw some of their muscle away from the museum. As they emerged from the construction site, Marcus could see the museum's distinctive dome in the distance. Somewhere in that building was proof that could expose Vista's entire operation. Proof that Mrs. Chen had carefully preserved in her art, waiting for someone to understand its significance. They're not just going to let us walk in there, he said quietly. Elena's expression was determined. No, they're not. That's why we're not going through the front door. Elena parked the Tesla 3 blocks from the museum in an underground garage. Robert's team had vetted. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the city streets. They had less than 45 minutes until the museum closed. The loading dock, Elena said, pulling up blueprints on her phone. Sarah found us an ally, a maintenance worker whose mother lost her home to Vista's HOA scheme. He'll let us in, but we have to be quick. As they approached the loading dock, Marcus noticed a familiar black SUV parked nearby. We're not the only ones who figured it out. The maintenance worker, a young man named Mike, was nervously waiting by a side door. They're already inside, he whispered as he let them in. 2 guys in suits showing some kind of warrant to the curator. Said they're from the Cultural Heritage Protection Unit. Never heard of it. Fake credentials, Elena muttered. How long ago? 10 minutes. They're searching the storage areas now. Mike handed them each a maintenance uniform and badge. These'll get you past security, but hurry. My supervisor's due back in 20 minutes. They quickly changed and followed Mike through a maze of service corridors. The basement storage area was vast, filled with crated artifacts and climate-controlled rooms. They could hear voices echoing from somewhere ahead. Storage room C, Mike said, pointing. That's where they moved the sculptures after Mrs. Chen's donation. But be careful, they've got some kind of scanning equipment with them. Marcus and Elena waited in an alcove as 2 men in suits passed by, carrying what looked like handheld metal detectors. Once they were gone, Mike led them to a heavy door marked Storage Room C. Mrs. Chen's birthday, Marcus muttered, looking at the keypad. Jason said that's the password. He thought back to his conversations with her, trying to remember. She always said she shared a birthday with the museum's founding. April 15th, 1942, he punched in 4151942. The lock clicked open. Inside, the room was filled with carefully wrapped sculptures, each tagged and catalogued. In the center stood 3 large crates marked Chen Collection Dragons. These weren't just art pieces, Marcus said, examining the crates. Mrs. Chen's husband worked at the paper mill before it closed. She must have suspected the contamination years ago. Elena was already working on opening the first crate. Inside, one of Mrs. Chen's famous dragons curved gracefully, its ceramic scales gleaming under the storage room lights. But something was different about this one. "Look at the pattern of the scales," Marcus said, his chemistry teacher's eye catching the detail. "They're not random. They're a map," Elena finished. "Each scale shows contamination levels." She encoded environmental data into the design itself. Marcus carefully lifted the dragon, feeling its weight. "There's something inside it too. Listen." He gently shook it, hearing a faint rattle. "We need to document everything before we open them," Elena said, pulling out her phone. "Robert's team will need clear evidence that we found these items exactly as they were stored." But as she began taking photos, they heard voices approaching. The men with the scanners were returning. "Hide!" Mike hissed, quickly stepping outside to intercept them. Marcus and Elena ducked behind a large storage cabinet, watching through a gap as Mike confronted the men. "Sorry, gentlemen," they heard him say. "Just got word from upstairs. Supervisor needs this area cleared for emergency maintenance. Pipe leak." "We have authorization to be here," one man said firmly. "Not anymore," Mike replied. "Water damage. Risk trumps everything else. Museum policy. You'll have to come back tomorrow." There was a tense moment of silence. Then, "We'll need to verify this with your supervisor." "Go ahead," Mike said. "She's upstairs in her office. Room 205. They heard footsteps retreating, but Eleanor gripped Marcus's arm. "They'll check and be right back. We need to work fast." Moving quickly, they photographed each dragon in detail, then carefully examined them for openings. The third dragon had a barely visible seam along its belly. "Here," Marcus said, pressing gently. The seam opened, revealing a hollow interior filled with papers. His hands shook as he removed the contents: USB drives, photographs, soil sample reports, and a handwritten journal. The dates went back 15 years. Mrs. Chen had been documenting the contamination since before the mill closed. "She knew," Marcus breathed. "She knew they'd try to cover it up eventually. That's why she made the dragons, to preserve the evidence where no one would think to look." Elena was rapidly scanning the documents with her phone when they heard running footsteps. Mike burst in, panic on his face. "They're coming back," he gasped. "With security. They know the supervisor story was fake." Marcus quickly replaced the documents and resealed the dragon. "We got what we needed, but we can't let them move these sculptures. Once they realize what's inside..." "Already handled," Elena said, typing rapidly on her phone. "Robert's team just filed an emergency court order to freeze all museum assets related to the Chen collection, citing their historical and cultural significance. Judge Warren signed it. He's one of the few not in Vista's pocket." The footsteps were getting closer. Mike pointed to a service elevator in the corner. "That goes up to the loading dock. I'll hold them off as long as I can." As they hurried to the elevator, Marcus turned back. "Mike, your mother's house. We're going to make this right. All of it." Mike nodded grimly. "Just expose them. That's all we want." The elevator doors closed just as they heard voices entering the storage room. They had the evidence now, proof of years of environmental crimes carefully preserved in plain sight. But as they emerged onto the loading dock, Marcus saw more black SUVs arriving. "They're not going to let us leave with this," he said quietly. Elena started the Tesla with her phone, calling it to their location. "No," she agreed. "They're not good thing we planned for that too." The Tesla's autonomous driving features proved invaluable as they escaped the museum, weaving through traffic while Elena and Marcus examined the evidence they'd photographed. Multiple SUVs followed, but the evening traffic worked in their favor, allowing them to blend in with commuters heading home. "Look at these readings," Marcus said, zooming in on photos of the dragon scales. "The contamination levels are 10 times what's legally allowable, and these dates, they knew about it before they even closed the mill." Elena was about to respond when her phone rang, an encrypted call from Robert. "You need to get to the safe house now," he said without preamble. "We've got a new player in the game. Someone from inside Vista just reached out." 20 minutes later, after ensuring they weren't followed, they arrived at a nondescript apartment building on the outskirts of town. Robert was waiting in the underground garage with a woman Marcus didn't recognize. She was in her 50s, elegantly dressed but clearly nervous. "This is Patricia Wellington," Robert said quietly. "Thomas Wellington's wife." Marcus stared at the woman who had notarized so many of the fraudulent documents. She met his gaze steadily, though her hands trembled slightly. "I'm here to make things right," she said. "What they're doing, what Thomas is doing, it's gone too far." Upstairs in the safe house, Patricia revealed the full scope of Vista's operations. "It started small," she explained. "Thomas discovered the contamination reports years ago, when he was just a junior executive. He saw an opportunity. Buy contaminated industrial sites, cheap, create HOAs to control the surrounding properties, then develop without having to worry about liability." She pulled out her own USB drive. "I've been collecting evidence for months. The Lake Morrison property? That was supposed to be their crowning achievement. The contamination there isn't just from the paper mill. They've been secretly dumping new waste, making it impossible to trace back to the original source." "Why come forward now?" Marcus asked. Patricia's composure cracked slightly. "Because they're not just destroying properties anymore, they're destroying lives. Last week, I found out they're planning to build a primary school on the most contaminated part of the site. Thomas said the contamination would be contained by the foundation, but..." She shuddered. "I couldn't be part of that." Elena was already examining the new evidence. "These internal memos, they show Vista knew about clusters of unusual illnesses around their other developments. They've been buying people's silence, with medical payment agreements. Jason Chen discovered part of this," Patricia continued. "That's why they went after his grandmother so aggressively. When he wouldn't back down, Thomas ordered direct action." "What kind of direct action?" Marcus demanded. "They sent people to scare him. It went wrong. Someone got rough, and Jason fell. They thought..." Patricia's voice broke. "They thought they'd killed him. That's when I knew I had to stop this." "But Jason survived," Marcus said. "He's in Canada." Patricia nodded. "I helped him get there. Gave him money, contacts. It was the least I could do. But Thomas doesn't know that. He thinks Jason is dead, which is why they panicked." "When you found something at the boathouse?" Robert was typing rapidly on his laptop. "This changes everything. With Patricia's testimony and documentation..." "It won't be that simple," Patricia interrupted. "Thomas has contingency plans. The moment he realizes I've turned, he'll initiate what he calls Protocol Zero, destroying every record, transferring assets offshore, and abandoning all the development projects. Leaving the contamination for others to deal with," Marcus realized, "and all the families they've displaced." "We can't let that happen," Elena said firmly. "How much time do we have?" "Hours at most," Patricia replied. "He always knows when. I'm missing as soon as he realizes I'm not at my usual evening charity board meeting." Robert's phone buzzed. "Too late," he said, reading the message. "Vista just called an emergency board meeting. They're starting Protocol Zero now." "Then we move immediately," Eleanor decided. "How many properties have they taken over? How many families displaced?" Patricia consulted a document on her drive. "In this area, over 30 families, but nationwide, hundreds." Marcus thought of his own home, of Mrs. Chen's dragons, of all the lives Vista had casually destroyed in pursuit of profit. "We need to get this to the press right now, not just local, national, and the EPA, FBI, everyone." "Already happening," Robert confirmed, "but we need to move fast to prevent them from destroying evidence." "Patricia, where would they start?" "The main servers are at Vista headquarters downtown. They'll wipe those first, then start shredding physical documents at their storage facility." Elena was already grabbing her coat. "Marcus and I will take the storage facility. Robert, you..." And your team hit the servers. Patricia... I'm going back to Thomas, she said firmly. He'll be suspicious if I'm not at home soon. I can delay him, maybe feed you information about their next moves. It's not safe, Marcus protested. None of this is safe, Patricia replied. But I've been complicit too long. It's time to make things right. As they prepared to move out, Marcus's phone lit up with a news alert. Breaking: EPA orders emergency testing at Lake Morrison, following anonymous tip. Jason, Marcus smiled. He's still fighting too. We all are now, Eleanor said grimly. But we've got hours at most before Vista tries to bury everything. Let's make them count. The next few hours unleashed a media storm that rocked the city. Robert's team had coordinated with multiple news outlets to release the story simultaneously. Local stations, national networks, and major newspapers all broke the story at exactly 9 p.m. Corporate giants' toxic land grab exposed, blazed across screens and headlines nationwide. Marcus watched the coverage from the car as Elena drove them toward Vista's storage facility. Channel after channel showed dramatic aerial footage of the old paper mill site, complete with infrared imaging revealing the extent of ground contamination. Environmental experts were already weighing in, their faces grave as they explained the potential health impacts. Vista Properties CEO Thomas Wellington was unavailable for comment, one reporter announced, but sources inside the company have provided documents showing a systematic pattern of fraud, environmental crimes, and corporate corruption spanning multiple states. Elena's phone was constantly buzzing with updates from Robert's team. The FBI just raided Vista's headquarters, she reported. They got there before Wellington could implement Protocol Zero, servers secured, but their own mission was proving more complicated. As they approached the storage facility, they spotted multiple trucks being loaded with boxes. They're moving the physical evidence, Marcus said, recognizing several of Wellington's security teams supervising the operation. We need a distraction, Elena said, pulling into a side street. She made a quick call, and within minutes, a group of protesters appeared at the facility's gate. Marcus recognized some of their signs. Save Lake Morrison and Stop Toxic Development. Local environmental groups, Elena explained. Robert's been coordinating with them for days, waiting for the right moment. They'll keep security busy at the front while we access the loading dock. They parked behind the facility and made their way to the service entrance, using access codes Patricia had provided. Inside, they found organized chaos. Employees frantically shredding documents while security teams coordinated the removal of files. There, Marcus pointed to a section marked Property Acquisitions. That's where they'll keep the HOA records. They were about to move when Elena's phone buzzed again. It was a text from Patricia. Thomas knows I helped you. Getting out now. Be careful. He's ordered his team to use any means necessary. Almost immediately they heard shouting from the front of the building. The protesters were being confronted by armed security guards, the situation escalating rapidly. They're trying to create an incident, Elena realized. A riot would give them excuse to destroy evidence in the chaos. Marcus was already moving toward the filing section. Then we work fast. They began grabbing boxes, quickly photographing documents before security could reach them. The files revealed even more than they'd expected. Not just property seizures, but evidence of bribes paid to local officials, threatening letters sent to homeowners, and detailed plans for future land grabs. Marcus, Elena called urgently, holding up a file. This is about your house. Look at the date they started planning to take it. 3 years ago, right after Akiko passed away. They were watching, waiting for you to be vulnerable. The revelation hit Marcus hard, but before he could respond, they heard running footsteps. Security was heading their way. Elena quickly sent the photos to Robert's team, then pointed to a window. Service ladder outside. We got what we needed. Time to go. They barely made it out before security burst in. As they climbed down, Marcus saw news vans arriving, drawn by the protest. Cameras were rolling as security guards roughly pushed protesters, creating exactly the kind of chaos Wellington wanted. But Wellington hadn't counted on the protesters being prepared. Many wore body cameras, live streaming everything. Every act of aggression was being broadcast in real time, adding to the growing media firestorm. They made it back to Elena's car just as police sirens approached. But these weren't local cops. The FBI had arrived, responding to reports of document destruction. Marcus's phone rang. It was Robert. "Turn on Channel 7 now," he said urgently. They found the station on Elena's car display just in time to see Thomas Wellington being led out of Vista headquarters in handcuffs. But what caught Marcus's attention was the figure standing in the background, speaking to FBI agents. Jason Chen, very much alive and back from Canada. "He came back to testify," Robert explained. With him and Patricia both talking, Wellington's whole operation is exposed, but their victory was interrupted by another call, this one from Patricia, her voice shaking. "Thomas made a call before they arrested him," she said. "Something about burning it all down. I think he's ordered them to destroy more than just documents." As if on cue, they heard explosions in the distance, coming from the direction of Lake Morrison. The boathouse wasn't just a warning, Marcus realized. They're destroying the contamination evidence, and if that fire spreads to the chemical storage areas still on the old mill site, the whole lake could be contaminated, Elena finished, already turning the car toward Lake Morrison, along with the groundwater for the entire region. "I've already alerted the EPA and fire department," Robert said through the phone. "But you're closest. If they've set charges around the chemical storage, we're on it," Marcus said grimly. "Wellington's not destroying any more evidence or homes." He thought of his own house, of Mrs. Chen's dragons, of all the families Vista had displaced. This ends tonight. The race to Lake Morrison became a desperate battle against time. As they sped through the darkening streets, Elena coordinated with emergency services, while Marcus used his chemistry background to advise the hazmat team about potential reactions from the mill's chemical storage. The old processing tanks contained sodium hydroxide and chlorine compounds, he explained over the speakerphone. "If the fire reaches them and they mix with water, we could have a major chemical reaction," the hazmat chief finished. "Plus toxic gas release. We need to evacuate everyone within a 3-mile radius." They could see the glow of flames before they even reached the lake. Multiple fires had been set, not just at the boathouse, but around the entire mill property. Fire trucks were already on scene, but the firefighters were holding back, unable to use water due to the chemical risk. As they pulled up, they spotted several of Wellington's security team members rushing to their vehicles. Elena quickly photographed their license plates while Marcus noticed something crucial. They were carrying empty gas cans. "Got you," he muttered, sending the photos to Robert. This was direct evidence linking Vista to the arson, the EPA's emergency. Response team arrived moments later, led by Dr. Sarah Martinez, a senior environmental scientist. "Mr. Thompson," she called out, recognizing him from the case files, "we need your help. You know this property's history better than anyone." Marcus quickly sketched out a rough map of the mill's layout on the hood of a truck, marking the locations of chemical storage areas and underground tanks. "The main concern is here," he pointed to an area near the lake. "The processing tanks were never properly decommissioned. They just capped them and left the chemicals inside." Dr. Martinez nodded grimly. "Classic corporate negligence. We've seen this before. Companies abandoning hazardous materials to avoid disposal costs." She turned to her team. "Get the ground-penetrating radar set up. We need to locate those tanks before the fire reaches them." The next hour was a blur of activity. Fire teams created containment zones, while EPA technicians used specialized equipment to map the underground dangers. Local news crews arrived, broadcasting live as the drama unfolded. The story was evolving from corporate fraud to potential environmental catastrophe. Elena's phone buzzed with an update from Robert. FBI has Wellington in custody. He's not talking, but they found something interesting on his phone. Texts ordering the security team to eliminate all trace evidence at the lake property. More than enough for federal charges, Elena replied. Environmental terrorism on top of everything else. Suddenly, they heard shouts from the EPA team. Their radar had detected something alarming. The heat from the fires was causing the underground tanks to expand. The caps could blow at any moment. We need to relieve the pressure, Dr. Martinez announced, but we can't risk any water contact with the chemicals. Marcus stared at the lake, his teacher's mind racing through chemical equations. What about nitrogen? He asked. Liquid nitrogen would cool the tanks without risking reaction with the contents. Dr. Martinez's eyes lit up. That could work. But where would we get enough liquid nitrogen at this hour? The university, Marcus said immediately. The chemistry department has a large supply for lab work. I still have access codes to the building. Minutes later, they were coordinating with the university's emergency management team, while hazmat crews prepared for the delicate cooling operation. The fires had been contained but not extinguished, creating an eerie backdrop as they worked. Local residents gathered at the evacuation perimeter watching anxiously. Marcus recognized many faces, families who had lost homes to Vista's schemes, now witnessing the company's final desperate act of destruction. Mrs. Richardson was there too, having been evacuated from what had been Marcus's house. She approached him hesitantly. Mr. Thompson, she said, I had no idea about any of this. They told us the house was a normal foreclosure sale, my daughter's medical bills. We were desperate for an affordable home. Marcus saw the fear in her eyes, the same fear he'd felt upon returning to find his house sold. This isn't your fault, he assured her. We're all victims here, and we're going to make it right. Their conversation was interrupted by a loud, hissing sound from the mill site. The nitrogen operation had begun, with crews carefully venting the underground tanks while cooling them to prevent explosion. Elena, who had been coordinating with Robert's team, rushed over with news. The FBI found something in Vista's servers, plans for similar operations at abandoned industrial sites across the country. This isn't just about our community anymore. They've been replicating this scheme nationwide. As if to emphasize the point, a series of news alerts lit up their phones. Communities across the country were discovering similar patterns of HOA fraud around contaminated properties. Vista's empire of toxic development was crumbling, exposed by what had started as one teacher's fight to reclaim his home. Mr. Thompson, Dr. Martinez called out, we need you. The nitrogen's working, but we're detecting some unusual chemical readings. Your expertise could help us prevent a secondary reaction. Marcus headed back toward the containment zone, determination in every step. The battle wasn't over. They had stopped Vista's immediate plans, but the larger fight was just beginning. Hundreds of families needed their homes back. Contaminated lands needed cleanup, and corrupt officials needed to be held accountable. But for the first time since returning from Japan to find his life turned upside down, Marcus felt something he hadn't expected: hope. The truth was finally coming to light, and with it, the chance for real justice. The next morning dawned with Lake Morrison still surrounded by emergency vehicles, their lights flashing in the early sun. The nitrogen operation had succeeded in preventing an environmental catastrophe, but the scene remained active as EPA teams conducted comprehensive testing of soil and water samples. Marcus, who had worked through the night helping coordinate the chemical response, sat exhausted in a mobile command center, watching live news coverage on multiple screens. The story had exploded nationally, with major networks running special reports on the toxic HOA scandal. "You need to see this," Elena said, rushing in with her laptop. She pulled up a social media feed that was trending nationwide. HOA Justice and Vista Toxic were filling screens with similar stories from across the country. Hundreds of families were coming forward with accounts of suspicious HOA foreclosures near industrial sites. "It's not just Vista," she explained. "Other developers have been copying their playbook. Look at these patterns." The laptop showed a map of the United States dotted with red markers, each representing a case similar to Marcus's. Clusters appeared around old factories, closed mines, and abandoned industrial facilities. Robert arrived with more news. The FBI's investigation is expanding. They've found connections between Vista and at least 3 other major development companies. They were sharing information about vulnerable properties and coordinating their HOA schemes. "But here's what's really interesting," he continued, spreading documents across the table. "Remember those dragon sculptures? Mrs. Chen wasn't the only one documenting contamination. We found a network of environmental activists who've been tracking these developments for years. They just couldn't prove the connection to the HOAs. Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from Jason. "Turn on Channel 7, Mrs. Chen is speaking live." They quickly switched one of the monitors to the local station. There was Mrs. Chen, standing outside the Canadian consulate, her dignity intact despite everything she'd endured. Jason stood protectively beside her. "I came to this country 45 years ago," she said, her voice strong. "I built a life here, created art that spoke truth about what I saw happening to our land, our homes. When they threatened to deport me, I was scared, but I will not be silent anymore." The camera panned to show dozens of her former neighbors standing behind her in support, many holding signs with photographs of homes they'd lost to Vista's scheme. "My dragons," she continued, "were more than art. They were evidence. Each scale, each curve documented the poison they tried to hide. They thought destroying my sculptures would hide their crimes, but they underestimated the power of truth and the strength of our community." As if in response to her words, Marcus's phone began flooding with messages. Former students, fellow teachers, neighbors, people he hadn't heard from in years were reaching out, offering help. Many had their own stories of fighting corrupt developers and HOAs. Elena was organizing the responses into a database, working with Robert's team to identify patterns and gather evidence. "We're not just fighting for your house anymore," she said. "This is becoming a national movement." The command center door opened and Dr. Martinez entered with preliminary test results. "The news isn't good," she said grimly. "We've found contamination levels far worse than anything in Vista's falsified reports. They weren't just hiding old pollution. They were actively adding to it, using the site as an illegal dump for chemical waste from their other properties." "Can it be cleaned up?" Marcus asked. "Yes, but it'll take years and cost millions. The good news? We've documented everything. Vista can't deny responsibility now." Robert was already drafting legal documents. "We're filing a class action lawsuit on behalf of everyone affected, not just the homeowners, but anyone living in the contamination zone. The environmental damages alone could run into billions." A commotion outside drew their attention. Through the command center windows, they saw a crowd gathering at the perimeter. Leading them was Mrs. Richardson, now holding a megaphone. "We were all deceived," she called out, her voice carrying across the lake. "They used my daughter's illness to manipulate us into taking someone else's home. But today, we stand together. No more divided community, no more toxic secrets." The crowd cheered, their numbers growing as more people arrived. Local business owners whose properties bordered the contamination zone. Families who'd lost homes to fraudulent HOA claims. environmental activists with their testing equipment and documentation. Marcus watched in amazement as the scene unfolded. Where Vista had sought to divide and conquer, their actions had instead united the community in unexpected ways. His phone buzzed again, another text from Jason. Grandmother says the dragons weren't just about documenting pollution. They were about showing that art can reveal truth, that beauty can expose ugliness. We're planning something big. Meet us at the museum tonight? Looking at the growing crowd, at the EPA teams methodically documenting decades of corporate crime, at the news cameras broadcasting truth to the nation, Marcus felt a surge of determination. This fight had grown far beyond his single home. It had become about something much larger: justice, truth, and the power of community to stand against corporate greed. "Tell Mrs. Chen we'll be there," he texted back. "It's time to show everyone exactly what those dragons were trying to tell us." The museum, after hours, had an eerie quality, its marble halls echoing with their footsteps as Marcus and Elena followed Jason through the service corridors. The regular exhibits were closed, but a special nighttime press conference had been arranged in the main gallery. "You weren't the only ones finding evidence last night," Jason explained as they walked. "While everyone was focused on the lake, our team was working here." He pushed open the doors to the main gallery, revealing something that made Marcus stop. In his tracks, the room had been transformed into a multimedia command center. Projected on the walls were maps showing contamination patterns across multiple states, each overlaid with property seizure data. Tables held hundreds of soil samples, each meticulously labeled with dates and locations. But most striking were Mrs. Chen's dragons. Not just the 3 they'd found in storage, but dozens more, each containing its own carefully preserved evidence. "My grandmother had help," Jason said proudly. "A network of artists, scientists, and activists across the country. They've been documenting corporate environmental crimes for years, hiding evidence in plain sight as public art installations." Mrs. Chen herself stood at the center of the room, surrounded by environmental scientists and federal investigators. She smiled warmly when she saw Marcus. "Teacher," she said, using his old title, "come see what we've built." She led them to a massive digital display, showing what looked like a complex chemical formula. "Each dragon contains samples and data," she explained, "but when you combine all the information—" She pressed a button, and the display transformed into a 3-dimensional map of groundwater contamination spanning multiple states. "It's a molecular fingerprint," Marcus realized, his chemistry background kicking in. "You can trace exactly where the contamination originated and how it spread." "More than that," said a new voice. They turned to see Dr. Amanda Torres, the EPA's National Director of Environmental Crimes, walking toward them. "It's proof of deliberate contamination. Vista wasn't just building on polluted land. They were actively moving toxic waste between sites to hide the extent of the damage. The evidence was damning. The dragons contained soil samples, water tests, and documentation spanning 15 years. Together, they revealed a pattern of corporate malfeasance that went far beyond real estate fraud. This is why they targeted specific properties," Elena said, studying the data. "They needed to control any land where their toxic dumping might be detected." Robert arrived with more news. "The FBI just raided Vista's subsidiary offices in 6 states. They're finding the same pattern everywhere. Fraudulent HOAs created to seize properties around contaminated sites." Dr. Torres nodded grimly. "We've seen corporate environmental crimes before, but nothing this sophisticated. They created a perfect shield, using HOA laws to prevent anyone from investigating the properties they controlled." Suddenly, the museum's security system pinged. Someone was trying to breach the service entrance. Security camera feeds showed armed men in tactical gear, not police or federal agents. "Wellington's private security team," Jason said, quickly backing up data to secure servers. They must have figured out what we're doing here. But they had prepared for this. Mrs. Chen calmly pressed a button, and steel shutters descended over the gallery doors. "The museum installed these after we donated the first dragons," she explained. "Some of us always knew this day would come." Outside, they could hear sirens approaching, real law enforcement this time. Robert had already alerted the FBI when they'd arrived at the museum, knowing Vista might make one last desperate move. "We need to broadcast this now," Eleanor said urgently, setting up a live-stream connection. "Get the evidence out before they can suppress it." As if on cue, news vans began arriving outside. The story of Mrs. Chen's Dragon Network had leaked, drawing media attention from across the country. Through the museum's security feeds, they watched as Vista's security team was surrounded and detained by federal agents. "Look at this," Jason called from his laptop. Social media was exploding with similar revelations. Artists and activists in other cities were coming forward, revealing their own documentation of corporate environmental crimes. What Mrs. Chen had started had inspired others to speak out. Dr. Torres was already coordinating with her team. "This is enough evidence to trigger a nationwide investigation. We'll need to test every property Vista and their partners have touched." Marcus thought of his house, of all the families displaced by Vista's schemes. What happens to the homes they took? "The FBI is freezing all Vista's assets," Robert explained, "including the properties. Once we prove the HOA seizures were fraudulent, original owners should be able to reclaim their homes." Mrs. Chen placed a gentle hand on Marcus's arm. "But it's not just about getting our homes back now, is it? We've uncovered something much bigger." She was right. What had started as one man's fight to reclaim his house had exposed a nationwide network of corporate crime, environmental destruction, and community resistance. Through art, science, and unwavering determination, they had built an irrefutable case against those who thought their power made them untouchable. As the media gathered outside and federal agents secured the evidence, Marcus watched Mrs. Chen explaining her dragons to spellbound reporters. Each sculpture told a story of corruption exposed through creativity, of truth preserved through art. It was a powerful reminder that justice sometimes comes in unexpected forms. The following days brought a cascade of revelations as Vista's empire began to crumble. From his temporary office at Robert's law firm, Marcus watched the dominoes fall one by one. Thomas Wellington, facing multiple federal indictments, had started talking in exchange for leniency. His testimony implicated dozens of officials across multiple states. "Another board member just flipped," Elena announced, entering with fresh documents. "Carlton Myers, their chief financial officer. He's been keeping a secret set of books documenting every fraudulent transaction. Look at this." She spread the documents across Marcus's desk. The financial records revealed a complex web of shell companies, all designed to hide Vista's toxic waste disposal operations. Each HOA they'd created was linked to specific contaminated properties, with detailed calculations of potential liability costs. "They actually put it in writing," Marcus said, stunned by their arrogance. "They calculated how much they'd save by forcing people out instead of cleaning up their mess." Robert joined them, looking grave. "It gets worse. The FBI found evidence of direct threats against anyone who tried to expose them. Remember Jason's accident? That wasn't the only one." He pulled up a secured email on his laptop. Vista had a special unit, former military contractors, tasked with intimidating whistleblowers. They called it community management. Marcus thought of the armed men at the museum, the black SUVs that had followed them. How many people did they hurt? "We're still counting," Elena replied softly. "But here's something interesting. They kept detailed records of everyone they threatened, like they were proud of it." "That pride is their weakness," came a new voice. They turned to see Patricia Wellington in the doorway, escorted by federal agents. She'd been in protective custody since the museum incident, helping authorities understand Vista's operations. Thomas and his executives documented everything, she continued. They thought it made them look efficient, professional. They never imagined their own records would bring them down. A commotion in the outer office drew their attention. On multiple TV screens, they watched as federal agents raided Vista's partner companies across the country. Executives were led out in handcuffs, boxes of documents were seized, and computer servers were confiscated. But amidst the chaos, Marcus noticed something odd in the financial records. "Look at these payments," he said, pointing to a recurring entry, monthly transfers to something called Heritage Conservation Initiative. Large amounts, but no clear business purpose. Elena was already typing. "It's another shell company, but wait, the registration links back to Judge Sullivan, the same one who denied our initial injunction." He wasn't just in their pocket, Robert realized. He was part of the operation. The Heritage Conservation Initiative was buying up properties around contaminated sites before Vista moved in. Patricia nodded grimly. Sullivan isn't the only judge involved. Vista cultivated relationships with key officials in every jurisdiction where they operated. They called it their insurance policy. As if to confirm her words, Marcus's phone lit up with a news alert. Federal agents arrest 3 judges in ongoing HOA fraud investigation. The scale of corruption was staggering, but something still bothered Marcus. "The Richardsons," he said suddenly, "and the other families who bought our homes. What happens to them?" Robert had anticipated this question. "We're setting up a victims' compensation fund. Vista's assets will be liquidated, with priority given to making whole both the original homeowners and the innocent buyers they drew into their scheme." "But it's more complicated than that," Eleanor added. "Many of these properties aren't safe to live in. The contamination spread further than anyone realized." Dr. Torres from the EPA joined their discussion, bringing latest test results. "We're finding chemical contamination in soil, samples up to a mile from some of these sites. Groundwater pollution extends even further. Some of these communities may need to be permanently evacuated." The implications were shocking. Entire neighborhoods might be uninhabitable. Families who'd already lost homes would now lose their communities as well. "There's something else," Patricia said quietly. "Something that kept me awake at night after I learned about it. Vista wasn't just dumping industrial waste. They were approached by other entities, organizations willing to pay enormous sums to dispose of materials that couldn't be traced." The room fell silent as they absorbed her meaning. Dr. Torres immediately began making calls, mobilizing specialized hazmat teams. "How do we even begin to fix this?" Marcus wondered aloud. "We start with the truth," Mrs. Chen said, entering the office. She carried a tablet showing digital reconstructions of her dragon sculptures, each one's data now being used to map contamination patterns. "Art revealed their crimes," she continued. "Now science will help us heal the land. But first, we need to help the people they hurt." She showed them plans for a community support network she'd been organizing, connecting displaced families with resources, legal aid, and temporary housing. Other artists and activists across the country were creating similar networks in their communities. Marcus's phone buzzed again. It was Jason sending coordinates for another set of hidden evidence caches. The message came with a photo. More dragon sculptures in other cities, each containing its own damning evidence of corporate crimes. "They thought they could bury the truth," Mrs. Chen said, studying the photo. "But truth, like water, finds its way to the surface. We just had to give it a path." Looking at the growing evidence of Vista's crimes, Marcus realized they'd uncovered something far darker than they'd initially imagined. But they'd also discovered something powerful, a network of resistance, of people who'd refused to be silenced, who'd found creative ways to preserve truth until justice could prevail. The federal courthouse was packed as the RICO case against Vista Properties began. Marcus sat in the front row beside Eleanor, watching as Thomas Wellington and his co-defendants were led into the courtroom. Gone were the expensive suits and confident smirks, replaced by prison jumpsuits and grim expressions. U.S. Attorney Catherine Martinez opened the government's case with a powerful statement. "What we will prove here is not just corporate fraud or environmental crime. This is a story of calculated cruelty, of powerful men who saw families not as human beings, but as obstacles to be removed from contaminated land they never intended to clean up." The evidence unfolded over hours of testimony. Former Vista executives granted immunity, detailed the company's systematic approach to seizing properties. Environmental scientists presented data from Mrs. Chen's Dragon Network, showing the deliberate spread of contamination. FBI analysts traced the complex web of shell companies and bribes that had kept the scheme hidden for years, but the most powerful testimony came from the victims. One by one, families stepped forward to tell their stories. Mrs. Chen described how Vista had threatened her with deportation. The Richardsons explained how the company had exploited their daughter's illness. Each story revealed a new facet of Vista's calculated cruelty. During a break in proceedings, Robert pulled Marcus and Elena aside. "Wellington's team just approached us with a deal," he said quietly. "They're offering to return all seized properties and pay substantial damages if we'll agree to sealed records and no criminal charges." "They're still trying to hide the truth," Elena realized. "They're more afraid of exposure than prison." Marcus thought of his house, of how easily he could get it back by simply agreeing. But then he remembered the contamination maps, the spread of poison through groundwater, the communities that might never be safe again. "No deal," he said firmly. "People need to know what they did, what they're still doing to the environment." Back in court, Jason took the stand to detail his discovery of Vista's computer records. He explained how he'd created the back door into their systems after witnessing their threats against his grandmother. His testimony was particularly damaging because he documented everything meticulously, every file, every threat, every attempted cover-up. But the real shock came when Patricia Wellington testified. She revealed that Vista's toxic dumping operation hadn't ended with Thomas's arrest. Other companies, using Vista's blueprint, were still operating across the country. "They called it the Legacy Project," she explained, her voice steady. "A network of developers using HOAs to control contaminated land. Vista was just one part of a larger operation." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. This wasn't just about one company anymore. It was about an entire system of corporate environmental crime. Dr. Torres from the EPA presented new evidence, satellite imagery showing suspicious activity at other development sites across the country. "We're finding the same patterns everywhere," she testified. Fraudulent HOAs, falsified environmental reports, and systematic displacement of residents around contaminated properties. During cross-examination, Wellington's lawyers tried to paint him as a misunderstood businessman who'd inherited environmental problems he didn't create. But their defense crumbled when Marcus's students, now graduated and working in environmental science, presented their years of water testing data from Lake Morrison. "Our chemistry teacher taught us to document everything," one former student testified, displaying carefully preserved lab notebooks. "We didn't know it then, but we were recording the deliberate contamination of our community's water supply." Wellington finally broke under the weight of evidence. In a dramatic moment, he stood up and demanded to address the court. His lawyers tried to stop him, but he pushed them aside. "You don't understand," he shouted, his composure finally shattering. "We were containing the contamination. If people had stayed, if they'd discovered what was in their soil, their water, the lawsuits would have bankrupted every major developer in the country. His outburst confirmed what they'd suspected. The entire operation had been about hiding. Corporate liability at the expense of public health. As Wellington was led away, Marcus received an urgent text from Sarah. Chemical analysis came back from the dragon samples. It's worse than we thought. The contamination isn't just toxic. It's potentially explosive under certain conditions. Every site needs immediate evacuation. The judge, seeing Marcus show the text to federal prosecutors, called an immediate recess. Within hours, emergency response teams were mobilizing across the country, racing to secure sites that Vista and its partners had turned into chemical time bombs. That evening, as Marcus watched emergency vehicles racing through the city, he realized their victory in court was just the beginning. The true scale of corporate environmental crime was still emerging, and with it, the enormous task of cleaning up decades of hidden contamination. But looking at the determined faces around him, Elena coordinating legal responses, Jason tracking digital evidence, Mrs. Chen organizing community support, he knew they wouldn't face this challenge alone. What had started as his solitary fight for a stolen home had grown into something much more powerful. A nationwide movement for environmental justice. The verdict came down like a thunderbolt. After 12 hours of deliberation, the jury found Thomas Wellington and his co-defendants guilty on all counts. The judge, citing the extraordinary scope of their crimes, imposed the maximum sentence, 30 years in federal prison and billions in restitution payments. But the courtroom victory was just the beginning of a much larger process. Within hours of the verdict, the EPA declared a national emergency, designating all Vista-controlled properties as potential hazardous waste sites requiring immediate assessment. Marcus watched from the emergency command center as Dr. Torres coordinated with hazmat teams across the country. The scale of the cleanup operation was unprecedented. Hundreds of sites, thousands of affected properties, and an environmental disaster that would take years to address. We've identified 47 sites with critical contamination levels, Dr. Torres reported, pointing to red zones on a digital map. The chemical combinations Vista created, we've never seen anything like it. They weren't just dumping waste. They were mixing incompatible materials. The implications were staggering. Entire neighborhoods would need to be evacuated, homes abandoned, communities relocated. The human cost of Vista's crimes was still growing. Elena arrived with news from the federal task force. They're seizing Vista's assets worldwide, she announced. Overseas accounts, shell companies, everything. The preliminary estimate is over $50 billion in hidden assets. Will it be enough? Marcus asked, thinking of all the families who'd lost their homes. It's a start, Robert said, joining them with fresh documents. The judge just approved our compensation plan. Original homeowners get first priority, followed by innocent buyers like the Richardsons. But here's the interesting part. We found insurance policies Vista had been hiding. He spread the papers across the table. Vista had secretly taken out massive environmental liability policies on all their properties, expecting eventual discovery of their contamination. The insurance companies, faced with irrefutable evidence of Vista's fraud, had no choice but to pay out. The total compensation fund will be over $100 billion, Robert explained. Enough to relocate every affected family and start the cleanup process. Mrs. Chen arrived with her own update. The network of artists who'd helped document the contamination had transformed into a nationwide support system for displaced families. Community centers were being established, temporary housing arranged, and resources coordinated. Art revealed their crimes, she said, showing them photos of new sculptures being installed across the country. Now art will help heal our communities. The new sculptures were different from the evidence containing dragons. These were monuments to resilience, incorporating soil and water samples that would be cleaned and purified over time. Visible symbols of environmental recovery. Jason, who'd been coordinating with tech experts nationwide, had discovered something crucial in Vista's recovered data. They didn't just target random properties, he explained, pulling up complex algorithms. On his laptop, they used predictive modeling to identify communities they thought wouldn't fight back, areas with high medical debt, recent immigrant populations, elderly residents living alone. They weaponized vulnerability, Elena said quietly, but they didn't count on people like Mrs. Chen, Marcus added, or the Richardsons, or all the others who refused to be silenced. The command center's main screen lit up with breaking news. The Department of Justice was announcing a new environmental justice task force inspired by the Vista case. Its first action would be investigating similar corporate schemes nationwide. Patricia Wellington, who'd been instrumental in exposing Vista's crimes, was being appointed as a special advisor to the task force. Her insider knowledge would help identify other companies using the same tactics. For Marcus, the day brought personal resolution as well. The federal court had voided all of Vista's fraudulent property transfers, meaning his house legally belonged to him again. But watching the Richardsons pack up their belongings, he made a decision. Keep the house, he told them. Your daughter needs stability for her treatment. I'll find somewhere else. Mrs. Richardson began to protest, but Marcus continued. We're all victims here. Breaking up another family won't make things right. Instead, he accepted an offer from the university, a position teaching environmental chemistry with a focus on corporate contamination detection. His experience with Vista had shown him how crucial it was to train the next generation of environmental watchdogs. The EPA was already implementing new testing protocols based on Mrs. Chen's documentation methods. Her artistic approach to recording contamination data was being studied as a model for future environmental monitoring. Sometimes, she told a group of students touring her new exhibition, the truth must hide in plain sight until justice catches up. That's what my dragons were, truth waiting to be found. As evening fell, Marcus stood at the edge of Lake Morrison, where cleanup teams were beginning the long process of decontamination. The water still carried Vista's poison, but it would heal with time and care. Like the communities they'd tried to destroy, the land itself would recover. His phone buzzed with messages from across the country, other teachers, scientists, and community activists asking for advice on investigating corporate environmental crimes in their areas. The movement that had started with one stolen house had grown into something nation-changing. Ready to get to work? Elena asked, joining him by the lake. This is just the beginning. Marcus nodded, watching the sunset reflect off the water. Vista had tried to bury the truth, but like the toxic chemicals they'd hidden, it had finally risen to the surface. Now the real work of healing, both the land and its people, could begin. In the months following Vista's conviction, sweeping reforms transformed how homeowners associations operated across the country. The HOA Transparency and Environmental Protection Act, dubbed the Thompson Law by the media, passed with overwhelming bipartisan support. Marcus watched from the gallery as Governor Harrison signed the bill into law, surrounded by families whose stories had helped expose Vista's crimes. The legislation created strict oversight of HOA formations, required environmental testing before property transfers, and established strong protections for homeowners. This law isn't just about preventing fraud, Elena explained to reporters. Afterward, it's about fundamental rights, the right to know what's in your soil and water, the right to challenge corporate power, the right to protect your community. The impact rippled through the real estate industry. Development companies nationwide were rushing to prove their environmental compliance. HOAs were restructuring to meet new transparency requirements. But more importantly, communities were organizing to protect themselves. Mrs. Chen's artist network had evolved into the Community Environmental Watch Alliance, with chapters in every state. They combined artistic documentation with citizen science, creating an early warning system for corporate environmental crimes. "Look at this," Jason said during one of their weekly strategy meetings, pulling up a map on his tablet. Red dots showed potential contamination sites identified by local CEWA chapters. Green dots marked successful interventions, communities that had stopped suspicious development projects and forced proper environmental testing. "People aren't afraid anymore," he continued. "They know what to look for, how to organize, who to call. Vista showed us their playbook, and now we're using that knowledge to stop others from following it." The university where Marcus now taught had launched an environmental justice center, combining scientific research with legal advocacy. His students were developing new methods for detecting and documenting contamination. Building on Mrs. Chen's artistic approach, "It's not enough to just find the pollution," he told his advanced class. "You have to preserve the evidence in ways that will stand up in court." That's what Mrs. Chen understood. Art can tell truth that raw data sometimes can't. The Richardsons had become passionate advocates for medical justice, using their daughter's story to highlight the connection between corporate pollution and public health. Their testimony had helped pass additional legislation requiring health impact studies before any major development project. One afternoon, Marcus received an unexpected visitor in his university office, Thomas Wellington's son, James. The young man looked uncomfortable, but determined. "I'm selling everything," he announced without preamble. "All the properties I inherited, all the companies, converting it to a trust for environmental cleanup and victim compensation." Marcus studied him carefully. "Why?" "Because I read the evidence. All of it. The internal memos, the health studies they buried, the lists of families they targeted." James's voice cracked. "My father built an empire on poison and pain. I can't change that, but I can try to make it right. The trust would add billions. More to the compensation fund, ensuring that every affected family could rebuild their lives. But money couldn't solve everything. Some communities, like the neighborhoods around Lake Morrison, would take decades to fully decontaminate. Dr. Torres and her EPA teams had developed innovative treatment methods, using natural remediation combined with new technology. The process was slow but promising. Weekly testing showed gradual improvement in soil and water quality. "Nature has an amazing capacity to heal," she explained during a community update meeting. "But it needs our help, and, most importantly, it needs time. We can't rush this process." The museum had created a permanent exhibition around Mrs. Chen's dragons, now recognized as groundbreaking examples of activist art. Schools brought students to learn how art and science could work together for social justice. Patricia Wellington, working with the Environmental Justice Task Force, had helped identify dozens of other companies using Vista-like tactics. Each investigation led to more revelations, more recoveries, more communities saved from corporate exploitation. "The pattern is always the same," she told Marcus during one of their regular updates. "They look for vulnerable communities, create fake HOAs, and use them to control contaminated land. But now people know the signs. They're fighting back before it's too late." The old paper mill site had been transformed into an environmental research station, monitoring the long-term effects of chemical contamination and testing new cleanup methods. Marcus often brought his students there, using it as a real-world laboratory for environmental science. One day, standing by Lake Morrison with a group of student researchers, he noticed something remarkable. Near the shore, Where the water had been deadest, small fish were swimming again. Nature was slowly reclaiming what Vista had tried to destroy. A text from Elena interrupted his observations. "Turn on the news! They just arrested the CEO of Summit Development. Same scheme as Vista, but we caught them before they could force." "Anyone out?" Marcus smiled, watching his students carefully document the lake's recovery. Vista had taught them all a hard lesson about corporate greed and environmental crime. But they'd also learned something more important: the power of community, art, and science to fight back and heal. 1 year after Vista's downfall, Marcus stood in his new home, a modest house near the university where he now taught. Though he'd won back his original property, his decision to let the Richardsons stay had led him down an unexpected path. The walls of his home office were covered with maps tracking environmental recovery efforts across the country, each green marker representing a community saved from corporate exploitation. His phone buzzed with a message from Jason. "Check your email. Found something big in Summit Development's files." Opening his laptop, Marcus found documents revealing a network of international connections. Vista's toxic waste scheme hadn't been limited to America. They'd been part of a global operation, using similar tactics in developing countries. "We need to take this to the international courts," Elena said during their emergency video conference. She'd just returned from testifying before the United Nations Environmental Committee. Communities worldwide are reporting the same pattern: fake property associations, forced displacement, hidden contamination. Roberts' law firm had expanded into an international environmental justice center with offices in 12 countries. "The Vista case created a template," he explained. "Other nations are adopting versions of the Thompson law. Corporate environmental crimes can't hide behind borders anymore." Mrs. Chen's artistic documentation method had become a global movement. Artists and scientists worldwide were collaborating to create works that both revealed environmental crimes and preserved evidence. Her dragons had inspired a new generation of activist artists. "Look at this," she said proudly, showing Marcus photos from an exhibition in Mumbai. Local artists had created sculptures containing evidence of industrial contamination, leading to the shutdown of 3 illegal dumping operations. The Richardsons' daughter had made a full recovery thanks to treatments funded by the Vista Compensation Trust. They'd transformed their experience into positive action, starting a foundation helping other families affected by corporate environmental crimes. "Your house was our sanctuary when we needed it most," Mrs. Richardson told Marcus during a community meeting. "Now we're trying to be that for others." Dr. Torres's EPA team had made breakthrough discoveries studying Vista's contamination sites. "The chemical interactions we found led to new remediation techniques," she explained. "Something good finally came from their crimes. We're better at cleaning up toxic waste than ever before." Marcus's university students were carrying the mission forward. Many had joined the Community Environmental Watch Alliance, using their scientific training to support local environmental justice efforts. Their work had already prevented several Vista-like schemes from taking root. One evening, while grading papers in his office, Marcus received an unexpected call from Patricia. "Wellington." "They found Thomas's hidden files," she said without preamble, "in a safe deposit box in Switzerland. It's all there. 20 years of corporate environmental crimes with names, dates, locations. The documents would lead to dozens more investigations, more communities saved, more corporate criminals exposed." But what struck Marcus most was a single memo, dated just after Akiko's passing, marking his property for acquisition. "Perfect target," Wellington had written. "Recent widower, likely to travel for grief counseling. Property crucial for contamination. Control zone." They had seen his loss not as human tragedy, but as corporate opportunity. The revelation should have angered him, but instead Marcus felt a strange sense of closure. They had tried to use his grief against him, but that same experience had given him the strength to fight back. James Wellington, continuing his mission to right his father's wrongs, had transformed Vista's former headquarters into an environmental research center. The building where corporate crimes had been planned now housed scientists working to heal the damage. "We're using their own resources against them," James explained during the center's opening. "Every bit of profit they made from pollution is now funding cleanup efforts." The Lake Morrison Research Station had become a model for environmental recovery. Where Vista had once planned luxury homes over contaminated soil, students and scientists now studied ecosystem restoration. The lake itself was showing signs of rebirth, fish populations returning, water quality improving, life reclaiming poisoned spaces. Marcus often walked the lake's shores with his students, teaching them to read nature's signs. "The environment tells us the truth," he would say, echoing Mrs. Chen's wisdom. "We just have to learn its language." His phone buzzed again, another message from Jason. A photo showed Mrs. Chen installing a new dragon sculpture in front of the United Nations building, its scales encoding data about global environmental crimes. "Art speaks truth to power," the caption read, "and now the whole world is listening." Looking at the photo, Marcus thought about how far they'd come from that morning when he'd returned from Japan to find his house stolen. What had begun as a personal fight had grown into a global movement for environmental justice. His new home might not hold the memories of his life with Akiko, but it held something else. Hope for a future where corporate greed couldn't poison communities with impunity. That, he realized, was the greatest victory of all. The 5-year anniversary of Vista's exposure brought unexpected visitors to Marcus's classroom. EPA Director Torres, accompanied by representatives from the World Health Organization, had come to study what they were calling the Lake Morrison model of community environmental activism. "What happened here changed everything," Dr. Torres explained to his students. "Before Vista's exposure, corporate environmental crimes were handled piecemeal. Now we have a coordinated global response system, and it started with your professor. Returning from Japan to find his house stolen, the Lake Morrison Research Station had become an international training center. Environmental scientists from around the world came to study not just contamination cleanup, but community organizing and evidence preservation. Mrs. Chen's artistic documentation methods were now part of the official curriculum. "Look at these numbers," Jason said during the anniversary symposium, displaying global statistics. "In the past 5 years, over 3,000 attempted corporate land grabs were stopped before they could begin." Community Environmental Watch. Alliance chapters identified suspicious patterns and prevented Vista-style schemes from taking root. Elena, who now headed the International Environmental Justice Legal Network, shared her own updates. "We've helped pass protective legislation in 47 countries," she reported. "The Thompson model is becoming global standard. Corporations can't hide behind HOAs or similar organizations anymore. But the most significant changes were visible in the communities themselves." Marcus walked through his old neighborhood, now transformed into something new. The Richardsons had turned his former house into a support center for families affected by corporate environmental crimes. The living room where he and Akiko had once planned their future now hosted support groups and legal clinics. "Your house saved our family," Mrs. Richardson told him during the anniversary gathering. "Now it's saving others. Every week more people find hope here." The toxic waste that Vista had tried to hide was finally being properly addressed. Dr. Torres's team had developed new remediation techniques that were showing promising results. The Lake Morrison water quality had improved dramatically, and soil tests showed decreasing contamination levels. Nature has an amazing capacity to heal, Dr. Torres explained, showing Marcus the latest test results. But it needs human allies. What your community did here, combining science, art and activism, created a new model for environmental recovery. The museum's dragon exhibition had become a permanent installation, with Mrs. Chen's sculptures now recognized as pioneering works of environmental art activism. School groups from around the world visited to learn how art could serve justice. Each dragon tells a story, Mrs. Chen told a group of visiting students, not just of corruption exposed, but of communities united. The sculptures preserved evidence, yes, but they also preserved hope. James Wellington, continuing his mission of redemption, had expanded his environmental trust into a global foundation. The money his father had made poisoning communities now funded cleanup efforts worldwide. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. "We can't erase the past," James said during a foundation meeting. "But we can work to heal its wounds. Every site we clean, every community we help restore, it's a small payment on an enormous debt." Patricia Wellington's testimony had led to investigations of similar schemes in 30 countries. Corporate networks that had once seemed untouchable were crumbling, as communities learned to recognize and resist their tactics. "The pattern is always the same," she explained to a UN panel. "They target vulnerable communities, create fake legal structures, and hide environmental crimes behind paperwork. But now people know what to look for. They're organizing before. The poison can spread." Roberts International Legal Center had grown into a powerful force for corporate accountability. They developed a rapid response system, sending teams to support communities at the first sign of suspicious development activities. "We don't wait for the damage anymore," he told Marcus. "The minute we see Vista-like patterns emerging, we move. Prevention is better than cleanup." The anniversary events brought media attention, but Marcus found himself drawn to quieter moments. Walking the Lake Morrison shore with his students, he pointed out signs of recovery, returning wildlife, improving water quality, healing Earth. "This is what they tried to steal," he told his class. "Not just houses, but the right to live in a healthy environment, the right to know what's in our soil and water, the right to protect our communities." His phone buzzed with a message from Jason. "Satellite data confirms it. Lake Morrison fish populations back to pre-contamination levels. Nature wins." Looking out over the water, Marcus thought about all the changes that had sprung from that. Shocking morning when he'd returned to find his home stolen. The house he'd lost had become something more valuable, a symbol of resistance, a center for healing, a reminder that communities could fight back against corporate environmental crime and win. The sun set over Lake Morrison, its waters now clear enough to reflect the sky. Somewhere in the growing dusk, a fish jumped, sending ripples across the surface. Life returning, healing spreading, hope growing stronger with each passing day. 10 years to the day after Marcus had returned from Japan to find his house stolen, he stood before a packed auditorium at the International Environmental Justice Conference. The audience included scientists, activists, lawyers, and community organizers from 6 continents, all part of the movement that had grown from one man's fight against corporate corruption. "A decade ago," he began, "I thought I was fighting to reclaim a house. What I discovered was something much bigger, a network of corporate criminals poisoning communities for profit. But I also discovered something more powerful, the strength of people united against injustice." The conference center, built on the rehabilitated Lake Morrison site, stood as a testament to environmental recovery. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, attendees could see the lake's pristine waters, now a case study in successful toxic waste remediation. Fish swam freely, birds nested along the shores, and families once again enjoyed the natural beauty Vista had tried to destroy. Mrs. Chen's latest dragon sculpture dominated the center's entrance plaza. Unlike her earlier works that had hidden evidence of corruption, this one celebrated recovery and renewal. Its scales tracked the lake's healing process, changing color with improving water quality measurements. "Art still speaks truth," she told Marcus after his speech. "But now it speaks of hope, not just exposure." She showed him photos from similar installations worldwide, each monitoring environmental recovery in its own community. The Richardsons were there too, their daughter now a healthy young woman studying environmental law. The support center they'd created in Marcus's old house had grown into an international network, helping communities fight corporate environmental crime worldwide. "Remember when we thought we were just buying a cheap house?" Mrs. Richardson said, smiling. "Now look at us, part of a global movement for environmental justice." Jason, who'd developed cutting-edge environmental monitoring software, demonstrated the latest version of his tracking system. Satellite data, ground sensors, and citizen reports combined to create an early warning network for corporate environmental crimes. "We can spot Vista-style schemes before they take root now," he explained. "The software recognizes suspicious patterns, property transfers, fake associations, unusual chemical signatures. Communities get warnings before the damage starts." Elena presented the latest legal victories, hundreds of communities saved, thousands of families protected, billions in corporate assets redirected to environmental restoration. The Thompson law had inspired similar legislation globally, creating a new framework for corporate accountability. "But our biggest victory," she said, "isn't just stopping corporate criminals. It's changing how communities see themselves. People know they can fight back now. They have tools, knowledge, support." Dr. Torres shared the latest environmental data. Lake Morrison's recovery had exceeded all expectations, becoming a model for toxic site rehabilitation. The techniques developed there were being used at contaminated sites worldwide. "Nature is resilient," she explained. "Given a chance to heal, it will. Our job is to give it that chance, to protect it from corporate greed, to stand with communities fighting for their environmental rights." As evening approached, Marcus walked alone along the lakeshore. The path that once skirted contaminated waters now wound through restored wetlands. He stopped at a small memorial garden, a quiet space dedicated to all who had fought against environmental injustice. A familiar copper urn sat in a place of honor, surrounded by cherry blossoms. The Richardsons had found it in storage after Vista's fall, returning it to Marcus. But he had chosen to place it here, where Akiko's memory could be part of the larger story of healing and renewal. His phone buzzed with messages from around the world, updates from community organizers, environmental scientists, activist artists. Each message represented another thread in the network of resistance and recovery that had grown from his personal fight. James Wellington joined him by the lake, his father's corporate empire now completely transformed into a force for environmental restoration. "Sometimes," James said quietly, "the greatest justice comes from turning poison into medicine." Marcus nodded, watching the sunset paint the lake in colors that would have been impossible in its contaminated days. The water reflected the sky perfectly now, clear and clean as nature intended. A group of his students passed by, heading to their evening monitoring session. They carried testing equipment and sketchbooks, science and art combined, just as Mrs. Chen had taught them. Each was part of the new generation of environmental defenders, trained to recognize and resist corporate environmental crime. "Professor Thompson," one called out, "we found something interesting in today's samples. The lake's healing faster than predicted. Nature's taking back what's hers." Marcus smiled, thinking of that morning 10 years ago when he'd returned to find his house stolen. The shock, the anger, the determination to fight back, all had led to this moment. His lost home had become something far more valuable, the spark that ignited a global movement for environmental justice. As darkness fell, lights came on around the lake, not the harsh glare of development, but soft illumination highlighting the restored ecosystem. In the distance, Mrs. Chen's dragon sculpture glowed with data showing the day's positive environmental readings. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles against corporate greed, new communities needing support. But tonight, watching the healed waters of Lake Morrison reflect the stars, Marcus knew that something fundamental had changed. The power of community, art, and science had combined to create something corporate money couldn't buy or steal. A future where environmental justice was possible, where communities could stand together against corruption, where nature could heal and thrive once more. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.